All right, this is Civics Ain't Dead, and about 30 seconds ago, we were saying we should have a signature kind of intro line to start every episode with. So I'm going to put Johnny on the spot and say, what do you think?
Well, here we are again, right? Josh and Johnny. And we've been doing this now. Obviously, this signature line will change, but we've been doing this now for over a year with the belief and idea that history and civics somehow still matter, even in 2026. And we're sticking to it.
Okay, that was more like a signature paragraph, but we're going to workshop it. So please subscribe and leave a comment and let us know what you think it should be. Hit that like
civics
button.
Ain't dead, right? Civics still matters, and so does history. Yeah. And a little bit of perspective goes a long way.
Yeah, I hope so. So today we've been mulling over this idea for a while, in some ways since the beginning of us deciding to do this podcast. But I think tonight we want to start with a basic statement, which I think most people could agree with, which is this. The average American is incredibly disillusioned with the federal government. The average American is distrustful of the federal government. And there's a belief that most, if not all, politicians are just corrupt. They're in it for their own gain. They're not looking out for the average American citizen. And a lot of that disillusion has fueled our modern day politics in the 21st century. So, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think there's some things that need unpacking and maybe aren't so true. But that's what we want to begin to dive into tonight. So I think the first question really is a historical one, which is like, if we as American citizens distrust the federal government today in the 21st century, when did that distrust begin? Has it always been there? Is it a modern, recent evolution, or when can we pinpoint the beginnings of that distrust? So what do you think?
Well, this gets back to our disagreement, I think, about definitions of libertarianism, which is going to have to be its own episode, I think, right? Because we're not going to get into that tonight. But I do think there's a particular brand of, let's call it libertarianism, even though that's a fraught term and needs unpacking and whatever. But like, there is a brand of grassroots libertarianism baked into the kind of the American psyche. And I don't want to essentialize, but I think it's been there since at least the revolution. I would even say it's been there longer than that. There's a kind of a radical English intellectual tradition of libertarianism, right, that goes back at least to the early 1700s, probably older than that if you go back to the English Civil War, right? But there's this kind of like a belief, it's not even a political ideology necessarily, that and you can think of it in these kind of like Americanisms, that absolute power absolutely corrupts, right? The idea that if a government is powerful, it is inherently going to give way to corruption. And so I think that there is a legitimate American belief in that kind of a thing, even if you're an institutionalist like you or I might be, right, or some coastal elite might be, to use a phrase. Even if you're an institutionalist, there is kind of like this Americana thought that locals better, small scale government's better, the people know best, right? And that the more power and bureaucracy you pump into the system, the worse it's going to get. And I think that goes all the way back, right? And you can say this without going full bore, like heritage American, in that, during the revolution, right, it starts as a revolution against the British government, but really against corrupt ministers within the British government. The people don't, before shots are fired, and even after shots are fired, their beef is not with the British people, and it's not with the British king. It's with these corrupt bureaucrats in their minds, right? They still think they like King George in 1775 when shots get fired on Lexington Green, and they all of the appeals, right, from uh, the Second Continental Congress are directed directly at the king, and the idea is that the king is still this kind of pure figurehead who represents kind of the head of the people of Britain, or the head of the people of England, or whatever. And it's government that is the problem, right? It is, at that time, King George's government that's the problem. But there's kind of this baked in belief that it's the bureaucrats, it's the career politicians, it's the lords that are running the Board of Trade and things like that, that are the real corrupting influences of King George's court. And if we can just get through to King George III, this is what American colonists are thinking in the lead up to the revolution. If we could just get through to George III and tell him about his corrupt ministers and what they're doing to us good subjects here in the colonies, then George III would snap out of it and save us from his corrupt ministers, right? And I think that is, if not the start of the belief, at least kind of the American spin on that belief, right? That it's government is corrupt, don't trust government. Maybe trust a figurehead, maybe trust kind of an executive, right? Like maybe the president is your man, but the government, the deep state, to put it in 21st century terms, is the problem. And so I think that that's there all the way back to the pre-revolutionary outbursts that you see happening in the Stamp Act crisis and the Sugar Act protests and the Tea Act and all that stuff, right? They're protesting the ministers. They're protesting government. It's only after bloodshed happens in 1775 that they start to think wholeheartedly about a separation from the monarch, and they start to think about independence. Now, some of the radicals have been talking about independence in the early 1770s, but most people haven't wrapped their mind around the idea of separate sovereignty until they get fed up with not just the corrupt government, but the king that they begin to fight against. So I think it's there all the way back. And you can see this after the revolution too, right? Where they bake that mistrust of government into the Constitution, right? Checks and balances as a thing are there because even the framers don't trust government, right? They want to make sure they keep the executive in check. They want to make sure that a tyrant doesn't somehow become president. They want to make sure also that the legislature doesn't become a corrupt body of career politicians, right? And so they're anticipating corruption and mistrust in every branch of that central government. And it's a reason why there are anti-federalists, right? Even during the Constitutional Convention, not everyone's on board with the U.S. Constitution. They think it's giving too much power to a central government and taking too much power away from people and from states as sovereign entities, right? And so that's why when they meet in Philadelphia and they go into sessions to create the Constitution, they draw the blinds, they close the doors, and they don't keep any direct notes because the people forming the Constitution know that there's a high amount of suspicion directly beyond those walls, even in Philadelphia, the capital, right? And so that, I think, is really interesting. That's happening in 1787, and even then, the people writing the Constitution know that they, as the central government, are not trusted by the people beyond the building. And it takes a whole year to get the Constitution ratified because people across the states don't trust the idea of giving more power to a central government. People like Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, right? They're skeptics of this centralizing government. So I think that's always there, right? And I think that rhetoric is a legacy of the revolution. It carries into the Constitution and the battles over ratification. And then it's kind of like instilled in Americans from the 1780s on as almost like a civic virtue, right? That, well, don't fully trust the government, right? They may not have your best interest. The people in power might be corrupt. The government is not always looking out for all of its people. And it's, I think kind of like an American civics tenet to distrust central government that way, right? And we're all, regardless of where you're at on the political spectrum, I think a lot of people, when they hear something like grassroots, uh, they think it's good, right? Like by nature, the people, the groundswell, the people out beyond the elite centers of power, if they think something's good, that's the trend to follow, or that's the political virtuous option, right? If it's some elite in some ivory tower or in some Capitol building, we're baked. It's baked into us as Americans to maybe distrust those authority figures, and I mean that without kind of essentializing this like rugged individualism stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's always been there.
Yeah. I mean, it does really tie into this debate we've had off screen about libertarianism and what that even means. And the fact that, from my perspective, people in the late 20th century who identify as libertarians are not, they're using the image of what you just described as a way to peddle an ideology that is not that at all.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and you see this, right? Like with the Tea Party movement, right? They kind of embody the symbols of the revolution. They embody the idea of libertarianism, right? That way, even if their version of libertarianism is just kind of like late capitalism. And we can, again, I think this is a whole episode of debating what libertarianism means now and in the past. Because there's a very old tradition of libertarianism in the English speaking world that has nothing to do with economic libertarianism,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
which is what I think they mean when they talk about, like, when the Koch brothers talk about libertarianism, they mean something beyond laissez-faire economics.
Yeah, it's more like kind of anarcho-capitalism, if anything, I would call it.
Yeah.
Basically, no government except for some streets and police, and then let us do what we want.
Right, but again, I think that's different than what actual libertarianism would be. But we can have that debate. So this gets us, though, to the 21st century, which obviously we're jumping over a lot of American history to do that. But this is the question I have for you, right? So what I just described is sort of a grassroots civic belief that government is not always trustworthy, right? And it goes all the way back. And again, I think that it's organic. I think that it actually, people believe that, right? And people believe it as kind of a political stance, but also just deeper than politics. Believe it in your bones, right? That the government shouldn't be trusted. And I think you will get that answer from people far to the left. You'll get that answer from people far to the right. The only people that might not come right out and say that is maybe like a centrist that counts on institutions. But something has clearly shifted in our current rhetoric about government and whether we trust it or not. And my question to you is that still just a bone deep belief, or do you think that that's orchestrated, right? Like, do you think that people in the late 20th century, early 21st century here, are we being led to believe we shouldn't trust government, or are we coming up with that idea ourselves organically? Groundswell, grassroots, whatever you would call it, distrust of government, or is something else going on?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good setup. I think the first thing to say is it depends on our periodization here.
Okay.
I would say it's important to talk about a period of American history from the 70s up until 2016, when Donald Trump gets elected. Because like him or not, like him or hate him, 2016 is a watershed moment for American history, for I would say global history. We can probably all agree that there is a tectonic shift that happens in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump, for better or for worse. That's a different debate. Um, you know, the 70s represent kind of the death or the end of the New Deal order that had been governing American politics and American society from the Depression up until that point. We get deindustrialization. We have the Vietnam War and the severe disillusion that American citizens have about that war effort abroad. You have stagflation. You have the scandal of Watergate with President Nixon, and you know everyone is kind of aware of like the 70s as having this just general malaise of things aren't really working in the 70s for Americans, for everyday Americans. Um, that is definitely not deliberately constructed by anyone. I mean, even the people running the government aren't trying to like make things shitty for the average American
Right.
citizen. I would hope not. But so there is a kind of a over the last 50, 60 years or however long it's been, you do see the onset of this sort of neoliberal policy that comes up through Reagan and this growing wealth gap, where it seems like the policies in place by the federal government are generally speaking not doing as much work for the average American citizen, American voter, as they might have been, in the 50s or 60s.
So you think that starts? This is the question, right? Is like back to periodization. So the modern distrust of the American government by American citizens. It starts in I think you're right. Like it starts in the '60s, with the Vietnam conflict and the expansion of that conflict, right, into Cambodia and Laos, and just like the failure of that conflict. Um, it is exacerbated again then by the Nixon Watergate scandal, in the early '70s. Um, but you're saying you think the shift happens in the '80s with Reagan, where the government kind of like actively starts pulling away from people's interests? Is that what you're kind of pushing at?
Economically, yeah, of course.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
uh, Reaganomics or trickle down
Trickle
economics or
down
however you want to
economics.
describe
Yeah.
it. I mean, that's if you look at any graph or statistic showing the kind of increasing wealth gap, it's around that time, and a lot
Hmm.
of it has to do with deindustrialization, which I mean, it's happening at in different places at different times. It's hard to really periodize it, but
But you get this kind of
yeah,
feeling of abandonment in places
yeah.
across
I
the
mean,
U.S.
I
Like,
guess it's also important to like say like what the group of people I'm talking about here are the people who vote for Trump in 2016, the kind of disaffected middle class white voter. If you're
the
a black
regions we grew up
citizen,
in. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, like there's going to be a different level of distrust from the government in the 50s and 60s by a black person than for a number of different reasons, right? So I guess it's worth mentioning we're talking about kind of this white middle America voter that really typifies someone who votes for Trump in 2016.
Sure. Yeah.
And of
I
course
think that's
that's
a good
that's a
distinction.
generalization, but it's one worth making. So yes, I would say that's where it starts. I mean, and again, this gets back to our episode I think we did on tariffs, which was like, when Trump says he wants to make America great again, what's he talking about? And
Yeah.
is it the Gilded Age? Maybe, but is it also 1950s America? That was working for a lot of people, uh, especially white people. But like I think a lot of Trump voters in 2016 are saying like, oh, my parents, growing up in the 50s, like they were living the American dream,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it begins to disintegrate, I think, in the 70s, 80s, and onward into the 21st century. Whether people realized it at the time or not, like that's just what kind of the economic history shows. So all that being said, though, well, actually, let me back up. Fast forward into the 21st century, another starting point is, I would say, the Iraq War. Um, just in the last 25 years, let's say, we have Bush and Cheney lying about weapons of mass destruction. We have a war started, uh, based on a lie. It leads to thousands of American military personnel dead, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi citizens dead, and without clear purpose, I would say, unless you just want to be brazen and say oil. But um, it's another notch in the belt of American imperialism that we don't feel great about in the same way we do about World War II. Where we think about, oh, we were the good guys in World War II. Don't know if we can say that in Vietnam as a country. I mean, certainly we support the troops always.
Yeah.
Don't know if you could say that about the war on terror. Probably not Iran. But
right. But what's interesting, right? And I don't know how it's a tough circle to square, right? It's like the same people that are the biggest skeptics of, let's say, these forever wars, right? The biggest skeptics of government, big G, they're the ones that then vote for Trump, right? Who now is the guy that is the government, right? And also the guy who, I don't think Trump has done anything since 2016. And I don't think you have to be a Trump skeptic to say this. Trump hasn't done anything to build trust in the American government for American people, right? I don't even think Trump supporters would say that he's, turned back the clock on this distrust thing. If anything, he's kind of fed it. And yet they look to him as like the fixer of that distrust.
Yeah. I mean, they look to him as the outsider who was going to fix it. It's like, voting for the alligator to drain the swamp.
Well, right. I mean, this is where it's interesting to watch people try to make sense of it now, because not only did he have a whole first term to fix it, and didn't, but now he's back in power, has been in power now for a full year plus. I do start to think that some of the this is why you start to see some of the base Trump support base peel away, right? Whether it's the Iraq or the Iran war, whether it's the inflation, tariff, economic mess stuff, whether it's whatever. But this is where if you're the one that's going to go in and fix it, there's only there is a timetable that you're working under, and that's where some of the MAGA base, you would think, would start to run out of patience. If all you're doing is talking about funding ballrooms and flying around securing sweetheart deals for your sons or whatever, then all of a sudden you are the government that people don't trust. You are the corruption that people have been rightfully skeptical of. But
that gets to the point that I just want to make, which again gets back to your question of like, has any of this distrust in government been like kind of actively facilitated? And if so, I mean, my answer to that is yes. And if so, like by whom, and like who does it benefit? And I think it benefits the exact people who are benefiting from Trump's current policies, which are the people at the very top echelon of society, running the businesses and benefiting from the tax breaks and the lack of regulation. I mean, the question we have to ask in the last 50 years of American history and American government is like, well, what does government actually do? I mean, it does a lot of things, but one of the main things it does.
What's the purpose?
One of the main things it does, and its main purpose, is to regulate business, because we, by the 1970s, had well over a century of evidence of businesses, especially with the Gilded Age being a flashpoint, kind of running amok and violating all sort of, ethical labor standards for workers. polluting the environment to complete, extremes. And so you begin to see a government in the 60s and 70s that actually begins to take accountability and say, well, we're going to pass some laws to protect the environment, to protect workers. And I mean,
And
that
that's
even goes back.
bipartisan. That's bipartisan, right? It's
Absolutely.
not a lefty thing. Nixon creates the EPA, right? It is a bipartisan agreement that is a purpose of government
Hmm.
to protect people from big business.
Yes. The people who have ended up, for, influencing right wing politics in American history over the past 50 years were not at all popular in a Nixon administration. They were the people on the far right fringes who were laughed out of the room. And that's where we talk about someone like the Koch brothers, who are these, they call themselves libertarians. They're certainly not. But they come to power through these organizations and private think tanks and institutions like something like the Heritage Foundation. And the question is, like, well, what does the government do? They regulate. What does someone running an oil business want? They want less
Deregulation,
regulation.
yeah.
They want deregulation. So how do you affect that change? Well, you begin to craft an ideology of anti-regulation and anti-government. I'll just read out quickly. So the Heritage Foundation, this is the group that has brought us Project 2025. If anyone's wondering why that's relevant, it's we're living through the policies implemented and proposed and advocated for by the Heritage Foundation. Just to give you an example of who's paying the bills for the Heritage Foundation in its early nascent years in the 1980s. Here's a quick list: Amoco, Amway, Boeing, Chase Manhattan Bank, Chevron, Dow Chemical, Exxon, General Electric, General Motors, Mesa Petroleum, Mobil Oil, Pfizer, Philip Morris, Procter and Gamble, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco, Cyril, Sears, Roebuck, SmithKline Beckman, Union Carbide, and Union Pacific. So,
Yeah, yeah. It's all the firms from the Gilded Age or later, right, that would fit that same robber baron model of capitalism. Yeah.
And what do they get as a return for their investment in a think tank like the Heritage Foundation? You get, I would say, the beginnings of this demonization of regulation, this ideology of anti-government, anti-regulation that is, as you say, kind of an organic, quintessential American idea, but also is a very
They've
modern
yeah.
uh, uh, belief system that you and I grew up with. I'm sure, like the idea that big government bad. It's not that big business is bad. That's something Americans would have said 100 years ago.
Yeah, yeah.
Today,
Or in
it's
the
big. It's
1950s, yeah.
oh yeah, for sure. I mean, but the idea that like the big bugaboo is the deep state, which is like that's a separate conversation, or just the federal government. Like that's the thing that God, if we could just figure out how to fix the federal government, then we'd be okay.
Yeah.
And not the fact that it's businesses, running around with no regulation, no oversight, polluting, violating workers' rights, whatever you want to call it.
Jumping through tax loopholes and everything else, right?
Right, paying less taxes than a middle class voter. That's not something organic that has just happened.
Mm-hmm.
You have people privately funding bills of think tanks who are pushing that ideology and have been from, I would say, the 70s, 80s onward up through today.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and this is what gets us to the second part of our title, I think, for this episode, right? The cynicism part, right? Which is, I think people have this instinct to distrust. And it's been pointed at big government, right? So distrust the big government, but also people aren't stupid, right? People know that insider trading is happening. People know that the markets surge every time Trump announces a ceasefire, like 30 minutes before us regular guys find out there's a ceasefire, right? Everyone with a huge stake in the stocks makes a killing, right? People know that that's corrupt, and people can see the results of that stuff, but people feel helpless because I think, right, that they've invested, or they've put their support behind someone who promised to fix it, was nominally an outsider, right? And then not only has he not fixed it, but he's clearly in on it, right? And benefiting from it. So I think that there's a level of kind of like shoulder shrugging cynicism that comes out of that, of like, well, what are you going to do? Of course, right? Of course, the congressmen, any side of the aisle you want to pick, are making trade deals and insider trading. Of course, there's, and so you end up with apathy, right? It was kind of my point, is that people think there's not a solution to fixing this kind of corruption. They think there's not a solution to breaking this kind of corruption. And they certainly don't see the federal government as the solution. And that's, I guess, where we're stuck. Is I don't know how you get through to people that the federal government can and has functioned properly, not just in its infancy, right? Like, there are plenty of eras that you can point to where the federal government mostly worked for the American people.
Well, and it's
I
not
don't
even
know.
just like past eras. I mean, you could point to
Yeah.
a couple years ago and say, like, look at some of the policies like the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, one of the big critiques of Biden was that he was such a career politician that he forgot he needed to actually go out and market his policies and remind Americans and inform Americans, like, here's why this is working, here's why we need it, here's why it's being effective and doing a good job. He just kind of assumed, oh, people will just see it and they'll recognize the results and know.
Yeah.
And this couldn't be further from the truth.
Right. He was not his own narrator in that sense. But you're absolutely right. Like, things like, again, bipartisanly supported things like infrastructure bills, you would think would be popular regardless of who you are if they work properly. Regulation of data centers, right? That has a lot of traction in red rural places, but it's going to take the federal government to ever do that, right? It's not going to be local town hall meetings that monitor data centers. It's going to be the federal government's going to either have to step in or not step in, right? And I think that all of the investment folks in those tech companies are hoping the government doesn't step in.
And they're paying a lot of money to make that,
to make
sure that
sure
doesn't happen.
Right.
And again, all the stuff about this kind of like anti-regulation ideology. Citizens United, a Supreme Court case in 2010, which basically rules that corporate speech is free speech and that a corporation can donate unlimited amounts of money to a political campaign. That amplifies it to the nth degree.
Mm-hmm. Because now you got lobbying. Yeah.
Speaking of bipartisan support, like I don't know what the exact number is, but it's like somewhere in the 80s or 90 percentile of Americans support, getting rid of Citizens United, but completely bipartisan. But you wouldn't really know that by turning on certain media channels. And I do want to also say, like, the role of disinformation here really plays a huge part. Again, going back to the 70s and 80s, but it's crystallized with Trump, who learned from the playbook of Roy Cohn. And we spoke about Roy Cohn briefly in our censorship, I think part 3, the second Red Scare. Roy Cohn is like the assistant prosecutor for the DOJ during the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. But he becomes Trump's mentor in New York City when Trump's coming of age in real estate in New York. And the Cohn playbook is like deny, deny, deny. And we see this probably most clearly with the 2020 election, but it's like deny all accusations and never admit fault, counterattack incessantly, accuse the person accusing you of doing what they're accusing you of having done. That was worded poorly. And then claim victory.
Projection is how I would word it, right? That every accusation is an admission of guilt.
Yes, thank you. And the third point is like claim victory no matter what. Like, don't ever admit you lost 2020. Don't ever admit the Iran war is a complete failure. Just say we won. And it doesn't even matter kind of like what the reality on the ground is. If you just keep saying you won, enough people will believe it.
Put enough energy into the bombast. Yep. And that is the playbook. Yeah.
And like, I mean, with that, like the goal isn't even always to sell the lie. I mean, everyone knows Trump lies. I think even his most ardent supporters know like it's all part of an act. But like the idea is to create enough uncertainty about reality to the point where, getting back to the initial kind of phrasing of this episode, like if we say they're all corrupt, like the goal is to get enough people to just kind of say like, yeah,
They're all corrupt.
they are all
yeah.
corrupt.
Right.
Um,
and then not do anything about it, right? 'Cause the final step is apathy, right? And that's where I think you have to resist the apathy, right? The temptation is to just give up and say, of course they're all corrupt. What can we do about it, right? But it's like you can't. Like there are levers of power that the people have, and many of those levers of power exist in the federal government. If we choose to use them, right? And I think that's the key, is that institutions were built for a purpose of people exacting that power, and so you can't give in to the apathy. You can't just shrug your shoulders and say the system's screwed, because that's when we get to the Trump era.
yeah, I mean, I'll throw out one quotation that from a woman that we've quoted a lot on this podcast, but this is from Hannah Arendt in The Origins of Totalitarianism, which published in 1951. She says, quote, "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and the distinction between true and false no longer exist." That's the banality of evil. That it's the apathy of the average American voter who says, well, Trump might be corrupt and Trump might be a pedophile and he might have committed crimes, but they're all doing it, you know? And the reality is, no, they're not. Like, not only are they not, but we need to vote for people within our institution who don't and are willing to hold the people who do accountable, right?
Yeah. There has to still be some adherence to decency, right? Like we have to still believe that there is a spectrum of morality, right? And because if they're all amoral, if all of us are that amoral, then yeah, we are in trouble, right? But I don't actually believe that's the case, right? And I think gotta adhere to decency. And it goes back to that censorship stuff we talked about. It goes back to a lot of our episodes. You cannot give in to that apathy, and you can't give up the idea that there is a truth and there is falsehood. Good, yeah. So stay strong, Josh.
Well, we started the episode by joking about how we can't ever figure out how to start recording the episodes, and here I am thinking, I also don't know how to end the episodes. So,
well, I think what we can say is thank you again for listening, and stay tuned for our next one where we're going to jump forward. So we've talked a lot today about trust and mistrust and apathy and the kind of like the doom and gloom, sinking feeling that nothing ever gets held accountable. Next time we're going to talk about accountability, and we're going to talk about why accountability seems like such a hard thing to attain in American society. It's not just a new problem, I think is kind of the tagline there. And so we're going to talk more about accountability next time. So stay tuned and keep following us. And thank you, as always, for being interested enough to watch.